The display I'm using in my Twin Otter cockpit is the same display that I've been using for flight sim for over 7 years now. And the reason for that is it's actually a very good display. It's a 3-screen display, which is kind of a common idiom in flight sim cockpits these days. In fact, this is made with 3 old-fashioned 19-inch 4x3 monitors, 1280 by 1024 pixels each, and more commonly these days the 3-screen setup is made with 1080p monitors, so those are widescreen monitors. Now, one of the consequences of using a 3-screen setup like this is you get a very unnatural aspect ratio. With the 4x3 monitors, this one isn't too bad or too extreme. This is roughly speaking a 4:1 aspect ratio. The effective width of this in pixels, including the bezels, is 4066 pixels, and it's 1024 pixels high. Now, the equivalent display used in widescreen monitors is even wider. It's roughly 5:1 aspect ratio. Now, I say that's unnatural. If you were to map out the extremes of what you could see in your peripheral vision, you'd discover that the aspect ratio of the rectangle you mapped out would be roughly 16:9 in aspect. And in fact, a wide aspect ratio such as this one, or even worse, the 5:1 ratio, really isn't suited to use in FSX if you're going to rely on the virtual cockpit, that is. And that's because you're looking at the world through a very narrow letterbox shaped slit. Now, of course, things are very much different if you're going to, as I have here, use a separate instrument panel and control panels and controls. And I think you'll probably agree that in this cockpit the view out of the window on my widescreen display is not too far short of being realistic. I mean, it would be nicer if it was slightly bigger, if I had bigger monitors there, the aperture was wider, and I had a more vertical resolution. But in terms of how natural that aspect ratio is for this setup, I think we're not doing too badly. But that said, it is still somewhat lacking. The display is approximately 1.2 meters wide, but it doesn't wrap around. You know, you might have seen these big projector setups where you get a true 180 degree or even 270 degree wraparound view. We don't have anything like that here, and what I've relied on over the years is I've used Track IR, which allows the view to move with my head. You can see the Track IR sensor up here, and that, you know, I can't praise Track IR too highly. It's one of the most essential add-ons for FSX that I've ever owned, really. But at the end of the day, the Track IR is still a compromise, and I'm starting to think about what I can do to make my display more realistic and more compelling without having to use the Track IR. Now, these days there are many more options for displays than there were 7 years ago. Now, the one alternative I have tried over the years is, and this was before I had this cockpit setup that I have here, but I've tried an HD TV as a main display, a 40-inch LED display, and it wasn't very satisfactory, mainly because at that size and sitting close enough to get a good field of view, the resolution of the panel was just too low. You know, we have to be thinking about the number of pixels per inch, which actually translates to the number of pixels per degree of your field of view. But we'll go with dots per inch for now, because that's a fairly common way of expressing resolution. I've made a few just comparisons here. This display has roughly 87 dots per inch, and that's very adequate. It gives me a very sharp, very crisp display, and I'm quite happy with that. But in comparison, the LED television panel that I experimented with briefly can only display 55 dots per inch, and that just wasn't enough. You know, you get, I mean, it's not quite that you can see the individual pixels, but everything just looks blurred and fuzzy, and it really wasn't satisfactory at all. So that was the only alternative I've tried. Now these days 4K TVs are readily available, and they're cheap enough to buy and to consider experimenting with in the cockpit. And in fact the width of this cockpit is pretty much ideal to take the width of a 55-inch 4K TV. Now the problem with that is, now that I've gone for a cockpit with the control panel and with the instrument panel and the controls and so on, a 4K TV really isn't going to be suitable. And the reason for that is, you know, we have this fairly narrow opening for the screen now, and if we put the screen behind there, we're going to cut most of it off. So we're not really going to gain any advantage from that. If I was going to use and really this is something you need to, if you're going to be setting up your own flight sim, there is a point you've got to recognise where you have to choose one of at least two alternative pathways to follow, and that is to stick with the virtual cockpit, which is obviously the much more flexible approach, because you can use any aircraft. You can benefit from the very nice virtual cockpits that we're increasingly seeing, or you can take the alternative approach, which is what I have here, which is to have a cockpit with real controls, real instruments of some sort, and use the primary display essentially as the view out the window. Now I have got the virtual cockpit on this one, and that gives me some advantages because I get the superstructure and some of the surrounds and things. So I'm pretty much committed to staying with this cockpit layout. In essence, I can change things to make the opening larger and to move some of the panels up and down if I need to, but I'm going to keep the instrument panel and all the controls. But I've been looking around at the alternatives, and apart from the 4K TV, I've got the multi-screen option. I could go with bigger screens, I could go with the wide screens. There is an option which I've explored in a previous video of using widescreen monitors but turning them on their ends into portrait orientation. That gives you a higher display. Projectors. Now, until very recently I had written off projectors as I couldn't understand why people use projectors, because I had this preconception that the images were very washed out, faint, you're going to have to use them in a very subdued lighting. And then just by chance at work, actually, we were using a projector to project something onto a wall in daylight, and it was a DLP projector, and I was really amazed at the brightness and the sharpness of that. It was, I don't think it was a very expensive one, but it was projected onto not even to a white wall, and that really clued me into the kind of brightness and sharpness you could expect from a DLP projector. So that would be an option as well. And if you look at the modern projectors, you can get a short throw projector, HD projector, which from 1 meter distance can project a 100-inch image. Now of course, if we're looking at projecting a HD image to up to 100 inches, coming back to those pixels per inch, we're down into ridiculously low territory, something like 22 or 25 pixels per inch conservatively, which is going to look fuzzy. Of course it depends on the viewing distance. If you project a 100-inch image and it's going to be 3 meters away, that's going to look a lot better than you might imagine if we're sitting at this distance. And of course this is really why we shouldn't be talking about pixels per inch, we should be talking about pixels per degree. So projectors. Now another piece of technology I looked at a while back is a thing called the Icarus Avenger, which is essentially a projection screen setup from simpits.co.nz, and it's basically, in fact they do two products, well they do more than two products, but they do two consumer level products. One is the Icarus Avenger 180 projection screen and support structure. So you get a kind of a cylindrical support frame and a 180 degree 120 inch projection screen. Now it's a rigid projection screen made of polycarbonate, and it's black, but it has a black very special coating of some sort, which is highly reflective and gives a very bright an intense daylight image using a projector, and it's actually designed to be set up with two projectors, so you get a 3840 by 1080 image, and projected on a 180 degree surface, and it's about 1 meter high. Now again, we're, you know, to fit that technology around this particular setup is probably going to be too much of a challenge, but it's a realistic option and a very attractive option if you're going to go for the virtual cockpit based simulator. You know, you have to again think about the resolution. Dots per inch is going to be relatively low compared to what I've got set up here, but you know, possibly a real contender and quite cost effective. If I were going to do that, I'd be tempted to go for the 270 version of that, which really, you know, I think is going to be the most compelling setup you can almost imagine at that price point. It does require 3 HD projectors, and the way the frame is designed, the projectors sit overhead. They're short throw projectors, but what you have to consider in that, you know, you've got the cost of the 3 projectors, the cost of the screen and the frame itself. If you go for the entry-level frame, it's made of, I think, MDF, is not too high, but on the other hand, it's got to be shipped from New Zealand. So one attractive option is to get the screen shipped, and I think you can get the plans for the frame and you can build the frame yourself. But again, you know, given the cockpit setup I've got here, I've really moved away from that as an option realistically. So that's projectors. We're not going with projectors. So as I was saying earlier, this display really, there's nothing wrong with it, and apart from the bezels in the middle, you know, which you get used to and aren't such a big deal, I'm pretty happy with them. The one thing that's missing though is peripheral vision. So the other option is to think about mounting screens at the side. Now this, you have to just think about how FSX does its displays. This is one window in FSX displayed across effectively one monitor. So FSX sees these screens as a single monitor. That's because I'm using an NVIDIA card with NVIDIA Surround. The other way that's technically possible to do this in FSX is to use 3 or an arbitrary number of separate 3D windows. Now it is generally accepted that creating multiple windows in FSX creates too big a performance overhead, and most people acknowledge that it doesn't. Some people do use that and claim to use it successfully, but at the end of the day it's not a realistic solution if you're going to try and use multiple windows in one copy of FSX. So this is a single 3D window, and as you may know if you've been following my build, the instrument panels are not running on the same PC. These are running using Air Manager on a separate PC that's communicating with FSX over the network. So we don't need to worry about those, but we do have an option of putting monitors at the sides to using some kind of technology to give us some peripheral vision. And what I'd like to do is to put a monitor at 90 degrees really to the front view on each side, and it just so happens that the space that's available to each side is about the right size to use a 32-inch TV that's in portrait mode. So we've got about 70 centimeters tall and about 40 centimeters from the front to the, it doesn't come all the way back to the frame, but you know, with that setup, when you're sitting in this cockpit looking forward, your peripheral vision is going to be pretty much filled. You know, that's going to be 120 degrees easily, approaching 180 degrees effectively. So that's what I'm hoping to do. Now the problem with doing that, and the reason I've held off really thinking about this realistically for so long, is that it opens up a whole can of worms. You need to move to a multi-computer setup. You know, there's no way to really do this on a single computer. Now to do this does drive up the complexity of the setup. significantly, because let's imagine we're going to drive both side views from the same PC. That PC needs to run FSX independently. All the add-ons that I'm using in FSX are including the possibly including the aircraft, definitely including all the scenery products, which means all the Orbix airports and the weather generating products, the Rex textures and so on. All of that needs to be installed identically on the second PC. And then we need some way of synchronizing the views between the two PCs. Now, you've probably heard of something called wide view. That's traditionally been the way of doing that. So using wide view, it will drive effectively the slave PC for displaying the side views. I think it drives that in slew mode, and it keeps the view and the orientation synchronized with what the aircraft is doing in the master copy of FSX. There is an alternative, which is the one I'm thinking of going with. You've probably heard of Opus FSI, which started out life as a weather program, but it does lots of other things. It does weather, real world weather. It does, I think, cockpit motion effects, kind of like EasyCA, which is what I'm using on here. But for our present purposes, it has a thing called, I think it's called Live View, and that can synchronize the views on multiple copies of FSX across a network. So I think we're going to go with that one, and that definitely means I'm also going to have to stop using Active Sky 2016 for my real world weather and switch to using Opus for the weather. Now, it is reputed to be a very flexible and effective weather engine, so I haven't got too many reservations about that, other than setting things up in the first place. You know, this is going to be a nightmare of changes really. I'm hoping that means the weather will be synchronized across the different PCs. AI traffic doesn't synchronize using Opus, but I have learned that Wide View, or the same vendor that produces Wide View, produces a product called Wide Traffic, which you can run independently, and it synchronizes. I mean, it's designed for use with Wide View, but it does work with Opus as well, and it synchronizes your AI traffic across multiple networked copies of FSX. So that's what we want. So in principle, apart from having to buy Opus, buy Wide Traffic, and buy multiple copies of probably FTX Global and, well, some or all of the regions and airports that I want to fly at, that should be relatively straightforward. Now, the thing that makes it less straightforward, there's always something, is that it's probably going to be impossible to buy, well, it is going to be impossible to buy copies of FSX boxed version, and so I'm thinking about going to, at least on the secondary PC to run the side views, FSX Steam Edition. Now, the problem with that is I don't know anything about it, and I just, shudder to think of going through the learning curve of setting that up, getting things installed into it. I'm presuming it's going to synchronize fine with, this Opus program, and there shouldn't be any compatibility issues. But it's just that, it's always the niggling small details of installing the aircraft and the scenery, because the folder layouts are different and so on, and if you've got to tinker with it, it's just those niggling details. I mean, maybe it'll just go perfectly smoothly and there won't be a problem, but my experience tells me that's rarely the way things work. And just to add insult to injury, if I end up having to buy and set up at least one new PC, possibly two, I'm probably going to have to think about doing that with Windows 10, and I'd rather not do that. I might hold out for Windows 7. I've got a couple of copies of Windows 7, and I might be able to install those, or I might be able to source a couple of other copies. But you can see, you know, it's not just a question of buying 2 TVs and plugging them in. It's a real investment in tinkering just to get this thing off the ground. So watch out for that. Maybe coming soon.